On the morning of October 15, 1970, a scheduled Aeroflot flight along the Georgian coast of the Black Sea shattered the carefully maintained illusion of the Soviet regime. This event, the hijacking of Aeroflot Flight 244, was the first known successful airline hijacking in the Soviet Union. It forced the Soviet leadership to confront an uncomfortable truth, that despite intensive surveillance, some citizens were willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom beyond the Iron Curtain. This was more than just a crime. It was a high-stakes Cold War drama that tested the boundaries of mobility, nationality, and legality. It resulted in murder, international diplomatic crises, and ultimately a tragic family end in the United States. The flight originated in Batumi, Ajar ASSR, Georgian SSR, destined for Sukhumi and Krasnodar. The aircraft was an Antonov An-24B, a reliable twin turboprop used heavily for short-haul routes within the Soviet civil aviation network. The hijackers were Pranas Brazinskas and his son Algirdas. Pranas was a Lithuanian national born in 1924, whose background was entangled with the upheaval that followed the Soviet absorption of the Baltic states. He was living in Batumi, far from his Lithuanian homeland, working as a construction foreman. Pranas had already been sentenced twice by Soviet authorities in 1955 and 1965 for financial crimes related to the state-run shops where he worked. His motivations for fleeing were both political and personal. The Soviet Union had constructed what was arguably the most formidable system of border control in history, the Iron Curtain. However, Pranas Brazinskas identified a key vulnerability: domestic Aeroflot flights. These internal routes were subject to far less security scrutiny than international travel. At the time, passengers were not searched for weapons, and there were no metal detectors or X-ray machines screening luggage. The prevailing assumption was that citizens in the workers' paradise had no reason to threaten others or divert aircraft to capitalist nations. The Brazinskases, carrying a small arsenal including pistols and hand grenades, took advantage of this security gap. How they obtained military weapons in a society where civilian gun ownership was restricted remains unclear, though it is likely Pranas used connections from his past involvement in Lithuanian resistance movements or black market channels. 5 minutes after takeoff, while the aircraft was at an altitude of 800 meters, the father and son made their move. They selected seats closest to the cockpit. They called over the flight attendant, 19-year-old Nadezhda Kurchenko. They presented her with a note demanding control of the aircraft and that the pilots divert the plane to Turkey, ceasing all radio communications. Kurchenko tried to resist, rushing to the cockpit door and shouting, "Assault! Watch out, they are armed." She attempted to block the entrance and knock away a sawed-off shotgun from one of the hijackers. In the ensuing struggle, Pranas Brazinskas shot her twice at point-blank range, killing her instantly. The shooting was chaotic. Several crew members were wounded. The commander attempted to disorient the hijackers by intentionally pitching the aircraft up and then sharply down, a maneuver known as nosediving, but this failed. The bullet that killed Kurchenko transformed the escape attempt into a capital murder case. A pilot later recounted that the hijackers showed no mercy and would have killed more people if necessary. Russian media reported that there were no armed guards on board, though Pranas Brazinskas later claimed the shootout was due to resistance from 2 armed guards. The hijackers occupied the cockpit, compelling the captain to turn the aircraft southwest toward Turkish airspace. The crossing from Soviet to Turkish airspace took only minutes, representing the breach of a major geopolitical boundary. Aeroflot Flight 244 landed in Trabzon, Turkey, where the hijackers surrendered to Turkish authorities. The remaining 49 occupants, 45 passengers and 4 crew members, survived. The Soviet government immediately demanded the extradition of the hijackers, invoking international law and bilateral agreements. Moscow characterized the incident as air piracy and murder, asserting the hijackers must return to face Soviet justice. The Kremlin launched a propaganda campaign characterizing Pranas as a fascist collaborator or war criminal, intending to delegitimize any claim to political asylum. Turkey, a NATO member, found itself in a delicate position. While sympathetic to those fleeing communism, it shared a border with the Soviet Union and needed to manage relations carefully. The case was a legal and diplomatic maze. Were the Brazinskases common criminals, or were they political refugees? Ultimately, Turkey refused to extradite them to the Soviet authorities, despite the fury of Moscow. The plane and its passengers were soon returned to the Soviet Union. The hijackers were tried under Turkish law in 1971, convicted of air piracy and murder, and initially sentenced to death. However, the executions were never carried out. After spending some time in prison, the Brazinskases were granted amnesty in 1974. They made their way through Italy and Venezuela, finally arriving in the United States. They were initially arrested, but later allowed to apply for asylum and settled under new identities. The U.S. decision to accept the men, despite the violent nature of their defection, fit into a broader Cold War strategy of welcoming defectors. The U.S. government used such cases for propaganda value, portraying each defection as a vote against communism, and felt a moral obligation to assist those fleeing tyranny. The Soviet Union reacted with sustained outrage, condemning the United States for granting asylum to murderers. Up until the Soviet Union's dissolution in 1991, Moscow continued to press for their extradition. They regularly alleged that American officials were hypocritical in harboring terrorists who attacked the aircraft of socialist countries. The U.S. State Department in 1978 officially stated that it did not consider the hijacking of the Soviet plane to be an act of terrorism. The elder Brazinskas Pranas presented his crime as a heroic struggle against communism, his only chance for protection in the West. The Aeroflot 244 hijacking was a propaganda disaster for the Soviets. It revealed deep fault lines in a system built on coercion. In response, Soviet authorities implemented sweeping changes to aviation security. For the first time, Aeroflot introduced security screening for domestic flights, including searches of passengers and luggage. Armed security personnel, often from the Ministry of the Interior or KGB, were placed aboard flights considered at risk, particularly those near border regions. Furthermore, aircraft were modified to reinforce cockpit doors. One crew member, after surviving the attack, recounted how pilots were issued pistols almost immediately following the incident. This military response to security eventually shifted, with authorities realizing that fighting terror must happen on the ground, not in the air. In 1971, a new unit, the Air Police, was established to handle airport security, passport control, and passenger screening. Meanwhile, the victim, Nadezhda Kurchenko, became a Soviet martyr. The government posthumously awarded her the Order of the Red Banner. Streets, schools, and even a mountain in asteroid 2349 Kurchenko were named in her honor. The Aeroflot 244 case also occurred amidst a global wave of skyjacking that was reaching its apex, with a hijacking attempt happening every 5 or 6 days in that era. The incident highlights the struggle of the international community to develop consistent laws regarding air piracy, grappling with whether hijackers were criminals or political refugees. The Brazinskas saga finally concluded in tragic domestic violence decades later. Living under new identities in the US, Pranas as Frank White and Algirdas as Albert Victor White, their relationship dissolved. In 2002, in Santa Monica, California, Algirdas murdered his 77-year-old father, Pranas, during a family argument. Algirdas claimed his father had a long history of violence, and some accounts suggest Pranas, ever paranoid, mistook his son for a KGB agent. Algirdas was convicted of second-degree murder with a deadly weapon and sentenced to 16 years to life in prison. The violent act that secured the Brazinskases' freedom was ultimately followed by another act of violence that tore their family apart. The Aeroflot 244 incident stands as a profound reminder of the extreme measures individuals took to escape the Soviet system and how those desperate choices resonated across continents and decades. Thank you for watching till the end, and if you enjoyed the video, please subscribe and join our growing community. A warm welcome to all new viewers and subscribers. It's great to have you on board, and I will see you in the next video. Until then, take care and blue skies, everyone.